Hey everyone, today we're going to take a look at Chu Nagura, Japanese natural whetstones. In this case, we are referencing the bench stone variety of Chu Nagura, similar to how we did it in the Tsushima Nagura video. If you want to know more about Chu Nagura in the context of a handheld Nagura variety, there will be a future video encompassing a basic overview of handheld Nagura, as well as a breakdown of different Nagura where they fit in the handheld context. In this case, though, we're going to look at it in the bench stone context and where it fits into things, use cases, availability, and what you would compare it to. So there are definitely some caveats to talk about when we start looking at the Chu Nagura concept as a whole. The first of which is whether or not when you're looking at Chu Nagura, it is really Chu Nagura. There are two ways in which you will find Chu Nagura sold. The first is as Chu Nagura. The second is as Mikawa Chu Nagura. Now, to better understand that context, traditional Chu Nagura, which this is one of them, comes from a mountain called Keita Mountain, and it is beside or next to the Mikawa mines. They are very related whetstones. They perform in many respects similarly. However, there are differences between the two in how they come out of the ground and how they are stratified. So if you are familiar at all with Mikawa Nagura, they have very specific designated strata gradings, and those gradings are related to use cases. So you can make a general conceptual progression of Mikawa Nagura all from the same mine based on what strata it comes from. You know a Botan should always be coarser than a Majiro. You don't see that with real Chu Nagura. Real Chu Nagura are sold as Chu Nagura. And they are not from the same mine, so real Chu Nagura is not Mikawa Chu Nagura. When you see Mikawa Chu Nagura, what it is referencing is a stone which comes from likely either the Botan, Tenju, or Majiro layer, but is unknown. There's a chance that it was not sorted when it was originally mined. So a wholesaler or stockpiler just finds a pile of Mikawa Nagura. They know, based on their records, that it is Mikawa Nagura, but they are unsure of what strata it came from, or maybe all the stratas are mixed. And rather than trying to send it to Sakamoto to have it identified or grade it themselves, based on experience, they will just call it Mikawa Chu Nagura and sell it. So it's a little bit of a, roulette as to what you'll get. Regular Chu Nagura, which is really the only Chu Nagura, right, is never really graded, except it can still encompass that same range. Like we would say, right, a Botan to a Majiro range for Mikawa equivalent could be a 3,000 grit to 6,000 grit. Analogous, Chu Nagura can still fit within that 3,000 to 6,000 grit range, but unlike Mikawa, it's never graded. So that's why you will see Chu Nagura sold and Mikawa Chu Nagura sold. Chu Nagura from Keita Mountain is the only real Chu Nagura, but when wholesalers sell it as Mikawa Chu Nagura, they're co-opting the Mikawa or the Chu Nagura term, and basically saying this is a Mikawa Nagura which will perform within the range of Chu Nagura, and I don't know what it is, so I'm just going to call it Chu, and it will encompass that range. So that's the first thing. They can look visually very similar. There are sometimes some ways you can make educated guesses, but truth be told, they can be interchangeable in visual attributes. So it's kind of important if you want real Chu Nagura, or you want to know if you're getting Mikawa Chu or real Chu Nagura, that you buy from a reputable seller and you ask them the origin of the stone. Additionally, And to make it even more confusing, some real Chu Nagara from Keita Mountain is then stamped by wholesalers downstream as Mikawa Nagara. Usually there'll be these purple stamps that are vertical right here that if translated would say Mikawa Nagara. The reason for that is because Mikawa Nagara sells for a higher price than Chu Nagara. And given that they're very related, they're from the same geographic feature and mountain range, just different mountains and different mines. Wholesalers will do that because it increases the price. So you can't always look at the kanji on the stone. You do have to talk to the reseller. They will let you know the origin of where it's from. So when you're dealing with real Chu Nagara or Mikawa Chu, and from here on out I'll just reference all as Chu, but in this case we are looking at the Keita Mountain real Chu. You have to look at it and use it or get a example of what it's going to perform like, so you can understand how it will perform. It does have Chu Nagara does have arguably a little bit of a larger variance than other stones. Typical styles of stones might have a 2,000 grit variant, and a lot of that is based on how you use the stone. The Chu Nagara have maybe a 3,000 or higher, maybe a little higher grit variant, so their range is very wide, and that's not because the stone can act like a 2,500 and then all the way up to a 6,500. It's because there are just a variety of Chu Nagara that perform differently. In this case today, we have a Chu Nagara that acts on the upper end of that range when compared to identified Mikawa, right? This performs very similar, a little bit under a Majiro Nagara. Truth be told, the average Chu Nagara probably is around Tenju to Majiro, a little bit. It could perform a little bit like Tenju, and like this is, like that, right? Performs a bit like Tenju, but more towards Majiro. But you can get them that are, between Botan and Chenju. But I would say that's the average, as they're hovering around the Tenju range. But they don't feel exactly like Tenju. They don't polish the same as them. So their use case, though, in a progression where you're using it as a middle stone, right, from your coarse synthetic to a finishing Awasedo, it is arguably about the same as any of that Mikawa range. While we stratify the Mikawa and use them as a progression, for the most part, you are good with choosing whatever Nakatoishi you want, and most Nagara fall within that range. Definitely all the Mikawa and all the Chu Nagara are realistically a form of Nakatoishi. We just categorize them as Nagara versus Nakatoishi, but they overlap in use. And you could go synthetic, whichever one you wanted, whatever Chu Nagara you got, and then to your Awasedo, just as you could do synthetic to Aizu to Awasedo. Now, if you're polishing or you're getting really particular, you can have steps within there. And if you want to do those middle ground steps between a 1,000 synthetic and your Awasedo, maybe you want 2 or 3 steps where you go Binsui, Aizu, Majiro, Awasedo. Or you could go Botan, Tenju, Majiro, Awasedo. Or you could go, some form of Chu, and if it's a coarser Chu, maybe Chu to Tsushima to Awasedo. So that's where we just have to grade them and look at them and get examples from the sellers. One of the characteristics of Chu Nagara that frequently help us to identify it as real Chu Nagara, and this is not a surefire technique or anything, but it is highly probable when you see this characteristic, is if we look at the stone itself, and we're gonna zoom up here. All right. Hopefully you guys can see that well. So you can see that there's these little black dots on the surface, and these black dots are not actually inclusions in the stone. They are little holes in the stone. And they're not, amazingly prevalent, but they are in the surface of the stone in a fairly plentiful fashion. All right. And Chu Nagara, it tends to be far more you know, it tends to have those type of holes a lot more than the standard Mikawa Nagura do. Some of the Mikawa Nagura will have holes like that. Usually they're the coarser ones, like Atsu and Ban. But when you're dealing with a Chu Nagura piece and it has these little holes in its surface, it's probably actual Chu versus a form of ungraded Mikawa. The super matters, but that is one thing I've found to be fairly consistent. However, it's kind of like some Chu have the holes, some Chu don't have the holes. Almost no Mikawa that is at this comparable Chu grit range has the holes. So your mileage may vary, you can keep that in mind. At the end of the day, they can perform very similar, and given the natural differences of from Chu to Chu piece, you know, I don't think you're going to be served too much differently from a Mikawa Chu versus regular Chu, unless if you're a real collector of things per se. So we're going to take a look at the Nagura now. Let's go ahead and take a look at our blade before we get started, just so you can understand where our baseline polish is at. Right. And these stones are, like most Nagura, the Tsushima is the oddball out here. They tend to be pretty thirsty. So we'll go ahead and spray it down, but you will see that over a few seconds here, it's going to start sucking up that water. And if we work the stone too quickly before letting it drink in some water, you will find it's overly dry, and the blade will start to catch on the stone after the slurry dries out very quickly while you're working the blade. So we do have to hydrate this a little bit more than maybe some other stones. Most Nagura bench stones, Mikawa Chu or real Chu, are going to have this attribute. They do tend to be fairly thirsty stones. So if you're going to go this route, just be mindful of that. You will have a far easier time finding regular Chu or Mikawa Chu Nagura than the graded Nagura. You can still find the graded Nagura, but it's a little bit easier on forums or from collectors. A lot of the vendors don't have bench size Mikawa Naguras that have grading on them from Asano readily available anymore. But they do have these Chu, and you can find both the Mikawa Chu and the regular Chu depending on the vendors you're looking for. I'm sorry, the vendors you're looking at. All right, so let's go ahead, and that's probably enough. We'll start our slurry here. I'm going to use the 1200, but as with most stones that are within, again, that Naka Toishi range, which most Naka are again, we can use a 140 to a 1200. It's whatever you want for your own purposes. In case you haven't figured it out, if you watched more of my videos, I tend to like to generate finer slurry when the option is available. So that's all we really need. The slurry does tend to come up this grayish color, but it can be different Nagura to Nagura. But for the Chus I've handled, it is usually this grayish, whitish gray color. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it does to our knife here. So one thing that is different between real Chu and Mikawa Chu is the real Chu is more likely to have potential sand inclusions in these holes. So it's something to watch out for. It's not that common, but it can happen to you. Regular Mikawa can have it too. That's just less common to happen. The stone is nice. It has a nice silky feedback to it while still being very present on the blade. You can see already that we're drying out here, so we gotta give it another drink. And as with most stones that are qualified as a form of Nagura and in a bench stone format, retaining that name, they are very consistent. They cut very well. And again, as long as you have appropriate expectations for what they will bring to the table as far as scratch pattern, grit ratings, price, that type of stuff, they are very enjoyable stones to use. They're very easy to use. And I would bet that this stone would likely perform the same way all the way through the stone. They don't have really like layers to them where the performance could vary. You know, you see that more in Awasedo and certain Nakatoishi, but the Nagura are a little bit more expensive than the comparable Nakatoishi, but you're paying for the consistency of the stone, both in, you know, every Chu stone is going to feel fairly similar, even with the grit differences, and the fact that the whole stone will probably be very reliably usable. So you will find the Nagura more expensive, but you're paying for the replicability of it. Let's do a few more passes. So unfortunately, one thing I'm not a super big fan of when we use these Nagura bench stones versus something like Aizu is that their thirst never really calms down. It gets a little better, but with some Nakatoishi, you'll find that as you use it, it doesn't continue to get thirsty. But I find with these stones, the surface is very thirsty and the water does not penetrate down far. So once you kind of get that surface level into your slurry, it once again gets thirsty. And it's just kind of how it goes. So you can already see we're drying up back here. Do one more. All right. So we've had a bit of time to work the slurry. If we kept going, maybe we'd work this slurry a little bit more, but I think this will be a very good example of what it typically will produce for you. And since you're not usually finishing on this stone, continuing to go just to see what happens is not always necessary. So here's what we are left with. Pretty nice contrast. It does have scratch patterns on the core end cladding, but a lot more on the cladding than the core. Truth be told, it performs, in this case, fairly similar to a Tsushima. But that's because a Tsushima performs fairly similarly to a Majiro. So when we said this performs like that, you know, we already put them in the same kind of class. So let's see if we can get closer here. And then we'll try the auto focus here. So as we kind of said with the Aizu, and even more so with the Tsushima, the Chu, this is also true. If we were to use finger stones after our work here, we could get a pretty respectable finish on the blade. It would keep a lot of that contrast between the cladding and the core steel. And a decent finger stone with a decent amount of time would remove a good amount of those scratches. If we have a good Awasedo, it'll make, of course, the finger stone job a whole lot easier, and it will maybe even make the contrast a little nicer. But if you have a stone like this, a Chu Nagura like this, and all of your Awasedo are really hard, instead of buying a finishing Awasedo for polishing, instead you could buy some Uchigimori fingerstones or some Kita fingerstones, and avoid having to buy a soft stone just for polishing. We could use a fingerstone on this, which eventually I guess I'll make a video about, and we would end up with a very nice serviceable finish. Would it be, you know, perfect and see all the banding and whatnot in the blade? No, but most of the time people aren't really able to work their knives up to that level anyway. So the stone works pretty well. I think we got good results out of it pretty quickly. We can see a lot of what's going on the surface of the stone. There's one benefit to this, maybe over the Tsushima, is that we can much more readily see the swarf generation, the metal content, how fast it's cutting, that type of stuff. So let's go ahead and clear off our surface here, and we will do a sharpening test so you guys can see what the speed looks like as just a sharpening. Now, when we're thinking about this as a sharpening stone, I'm not sure it's very efficient. I think there are much better Nakatoishi level stones if you're only doing sharpening. Like, a lot of what you're paying for here is that consistency that lends itself very well to polishing. That's, you know, it is a traditional sword polishing stone. It's in that stepping process. And I would argue the price reflects that quality and consistency. I'm not sure you're getting much out of this that you're not getting out of a Tsushima, and I'm not sure you're getting much out of a Tsushima that you're not getting out of an appropriate Nakatoishi that's not a form of Nagura, and will likely be cheaper than comparable Nagura. However, if you're someone who just wants multiple stones, maybe you want it for multiple purposes, or you just really like the concept of having this stone, it most definitely can give you some really good edges. I do feel that when we're looking at it versus a Tsushima, the polishing aspect of them is very similar. I would argue though that this is a better sharpening stone in two different manners. The first is with razors. I find that while the Tsushima Nagura can provide a depth scratch pattern and a fineness of scratch pattern that's comparable to some of the Mikawa and the Chu Nagura, how it interacts with the edge of the metal based on stone binder composition, concentration of quartz in it, and just how it affects the apex is actually of lower quality than the Mikawa or Chu Nagura. This is especially true with razors. If you try to do straight razor work on a Tsushima and then you jump over to this and do straight razor work here, even though their polish produces similar results, something about the binder in these Chu or Mikawa Nagura are more gentle and more consistent on the razor edge, and whereas under magnification, your razor edge with a Tsushima will still have quite a bit of toothiness to it, the Chu Nagura and the Mikawa Nagura will leave you that perfect, straight, beautiful edge to then clean up at the next step. Both are usable, but you'll spend a lot more time in the Awaseido phase for your razor if you use a Tsushima first, versus if you use a Chu or a Mikawa, you'll spend less time on the Awaseido because I think it gets it closer to being completed. That does hold true to some degree with knives as well. I think it gives you a more refined edge on your knife when you are sharpening with it. Once again, the Tsushima is usable, but if I was going to use these as last steps, I would enjoy the edge I will get out of this Chu Nagura better than I will enjoy the edge I get off of the Tsushima. On that note, though, once again, I think many Nakatoishi, good quality Nakatoishi, can actually compete in both of those camps. Aizu leaves, I think, a better, more refined edge than Tsushima when it's good Aizu. Again, you can get bad Aizu, you don't frequently get bad Tsushima. It's one of the benefits of a Nagura when you use that term. In benchstone, it's usually what it's indicating. And, you know, I think there are even like Tajima stones might perform similar to these Chu or Mikawa if you're just sharpening the edge of a knife, but you're likely to get either a lot more stone for the same price, or equal amount of stone for a far better price. So anyway, let's see how it does on our sharpening test here. So it's doing okay. I think it's a little slow comparatively. We're most definitely still cutting metal here. There's not much question about that, but I think other stones are doing it a little faster. I'm sure if I had used a coarser diamond plate and generated more slurry, there's a chance this would be moving faster too. But I can feel on the edge, and you can see in the swarf that we are removing metal most certainly. So maybe it's removing a little bit less metal for our efforts than the Tsushima, but as I had said, I think it's going to give us a little bit more of a refined edge. So that little slower removal of metal at the same grit pattern is probably what's going to give that to us. So what we're seeing could be a form of benefit if you intend to finish at this stone level. So definitely knocked our burr off. Let's just clean it up a little bit. And yeah, that's a really nice edge. Anything at the end of this Nakatoishi range, I mean, is going to give you a very serviceable edge. If you had watched the Tsushima video, and now we're talking here, I had done water-only passes on the Tsushima to try to get the best edge I could. I would argue the edge we got off of this, which still had slurry on it, feels just as good as that water-only Tsushima edge. So let me go ahead and see if I can get a better feeling edge with just water and some light pressure. When you do this enough, when you sharpen enough blades, you can feel on the edge how it's going to perform for you. I know some people might watch these videos and wish that I'd pick up a piece of thin parchment paper or newspaper or something and do cutting tests. There are other channels that do that. So maybe the day will come where I run out of ideas and I revisit these stones and we can do comparisons of cutting or something, but I think so much of your cutting performance is to the knife, to your method, how long you're on the stone, that I think you get more mileage out of just looking at the scratch pattern, which tells you a lot about how the stone will perform conceptually, and then you can work your method on the stone and explore its capabilities. I think it's a better use of time. And again, those other channels are out there if you really want. I don't think a lot of them are doing natural stones, but sometimes we're really splitting hairs with these comparisons anyway. And yeah, I mean, similar with the Tsushima, that did bump it up definitely to another level of clean. And this has reached past, I think, the Tsushima. Of course, if I'd spent double the amount of time we spent here on the Tsushima, probably would maybe be able to get comparable, but then you flip it back and you spend double, you match the time on the Chu, and I think you will find that you like the Chu Nagura's edges better, they're cleaner, they're truly more like a low-level Awaseto. And they might not polish exactly like a low-level Awaseto, but I think the composition of the binder and what makes Mikawa Nagura so attractive for razor users is what we're seeing represent itself in these really good late Nakotoishi, early Awaseto style of edges on knives. So anyway, hopefully you found that useful. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to have seen that I didn't cover, leave a comment, and I will try to fill it in at a later time. And otherwise, like, subscribe, all that stuff, and thanks, until next time.